Rumors of China's collapse have been widespread, and it has led people to wonder how this could happen to a country that was once projected to surpass the United States. In this video, we are going to hear from well-known geopolitical analyst Peter Zeihan as he discusses his perspective as to what could lead China to a complete collapse. We've covered Peter Zeihan in our recent video as he talked about China. But today, we'll be focusing on different points such as labor crisis, food crisis, and even an energy crisis. Thanks for your continued support for our channel. Let's dive right into the video.
The labor crunch situation in East Asia is far worse than it is in the United States. Because while we have millennials, they don't. And they also have something called the one-child policy, which has been gutting the Chinese demographic for 40 years now. And China is now the fastest collapsing demographic in human history. And there is no way the PRC survives the next decade in its current form. They just don't have the tax structure and the labor structure to even try. So this was always going to fail this decade. COVID may be speeding things up a little bit. And the end of China as kind of a major centerweight in the East Asian geopolitical structure, that is something that is going to reverberate for decades to come. Now, from the American point of view, this is all a net gain. From the Japanese point of view, this is all a net gain. But for some of the countries that were trying to have their foot in both worlds, have their cake and eat it too, this is a bit of a disaster. So if you are Korea or say Thailand or maybe even India, where you've tried to balance your security needs with the United States, your economic needs with the Chinese, you're about to lose both because the Americans are no longer interested in patrolling the world and they're resourcing their entire manufacturing system. That doesn't leave a lot else for anyone else.
In this first clip, Peter Zeihan talks about an upcoming labor crisis in China. China's one-child policy has led to a major shortage of young and upcoming workers, which Peter believes will leave China crippled in the near future. He notes that although the pandemic has sort of sped things up, China was going to collapse in this decade nevertheless. In this next clip, Peter Zeihan discusses how the leaders of China and Russia may lose power to a coup.
Isn't there the possibility that someone will break this cult of personality and there'll be a change in power?
It's a nice thought, but Xi has really done everything he could to purge the system of all potential rivals. And that has included intimidating into silence or imprisoning anyone who is capable of independent thought within the bureaucratic system. So you never want to rule out something like a coup. It could happen, but if that did happen, it's difficult to see whoever would pull it off to be able then to control the country on the other side of it. They might be a regional leader and they might be fine for their region, but the rest of the Chinese system would have a different opinion on who should be in charge. That's how civil wars begin. So I don't think that's a great thing to put your hopes into if you're hoping for China to remain part of the international system. In the case of Russia, it's not quite so tight. Which is not to say that it's not tight. There's probably 6 people remaining that have access to Putin on a regular basis, 3 of whom are toadies and who are incompetent. That's like the defense minister Shoigu or Medvedev, the former president. And then there's 3 people who are actually intelligent, like Patrushev, who ran the KGB for the longest time, or excuse me, FSB now, or Igor Sechin, who's in charge of the state oil concern. But of everyone within the Russian elite, the only one who might have the guts to actually off Putin is Igor Sechin himself. But if there's one thing everyone else in Russia agrees upon, it's that Igor Sechin is kind of a prick, and they would all kill him if he actually tried. So there's not a lot of hope in terms of Kremlin watching or Forbidden City watching in terms of what might be a smooth transition from these 2 leaders.
Peter Zeihan says that similar to Russia, President Xi Jinping is quite tough on challengers to his rule, but this still does not rule out the possibility of a coup. However, it may be difficult for a certain politician in China to rally the public behind himself, because political opinions in China vary from region to region. The same goes for Russia. There is no generation prepared to take over the government after Putin, so we may consider the possibility of a coup there as well.
Potash mine and processing facility online. It takes at least 3 years for a nitrogen system or a phosphate system. The Chinese have removed phosphate from the system because they're concerned about food security in their own country.
These are fertilizer materials you're talking
exactly.
about, correct?
Sorry. Yes, fertilizer. And China used to be the world's largest phosphate exporter. Potash comes from Belarus and Russia primarily. Canada is a big supplier, and so this is good for the United States, but for everyone else, it's kind of screwed. And there are some new facilities that are coming online, but they were already kind of baked into the math because they've been coming for years, so we knew they were coming. There may be a little bit of surge capacity, but it's already too late for the Northern Hemisphere's planting season. I mean, if you're going to apply fertilizer, you've already done it this year. And fertilizer prices based on type are up between 50 and 200%. That means in the United States, we have seen a significant amount of crop switching as farmers choose outputs that don't require so many inputs. And that's something we can do here because we can finance the difference. It's not a problem, but most of the world doesn't have access to something like farm credit. Now, you go to the rest of the world, and you're talking about farmers either not planting on what they consider to be their marginal lands because those will only produce with fertilizer, or using less fertilizer for the crops that they just choose to grow. So we know we're going to have a poorer harvest on a global scale, but we're not going to know just how bad that is until probably the end of the third quarter, beginning of the fourth quarter. And then the final piece is, of course, grain stocks. We have about 2 months globally in terms of stocks we've saved up, but half of that is in China. And every time the Chinese have tried to tap their grain stocks, they've discovered that it's rotted almost to nothing because their storage facilities are awful. In the case of some of the grains, they don't even have facilities. They just literally make a big pile of it along the side of all the roads. And then lo and behold, half of it rots in 2 months. So we really only probably have 4 or 5 weeks in terms of reserves, and that's very concentrated in specific countries. By the time we get to October, we're going to have a very solid idea of just how short we are.
In this clip, Peter Zeihan discusses a possible crop crisis, not just in China, but in the entire world. The prices of some fertilizers have tripled, which has led farmers to defer to crops that do not need as much fertilizer in order to maximize their profit. Some farmers have also chosen not to plant on lands that need fertilizer, which will severely hurt the production of crops. According to Peter, we will feel this shortage in the next few months. In this next clip, Peter Zeihan points to a possible food crisis backed by an energy shortage.
Panicking about the food situation right now is most of the world at the moment is eating last year's harvest. And so there was no problem with the input into the system. And so when you can't really tell what India is going to produce in 4 months, you look back and you see the flows are fine. That's helpful to a certain degree, and it certainly takes away some of the panic. It's not until we start the harvest season in the Northern Hemisphere that we're really going to have a good idea. Now, with energy, the shock has not yet hit. The Indians are proving willing to run the potential blockade and the potential embargoes and the potential boycotts in order to get Russian crude on the cheap. And as long as they are doing that, there's probably about 1 million, maybe 1.5 million barrel more of demand out of the world for Russian crude than there would be otherwise. Now, with the Europeans on May 30 deciding that they were going to go ahead with an oil block, that is going to make about 2.5 to 3 million barrels of Russian crude homeless. That's a big deal. So we're only now getting to the point where there's significant, permanent reductions on Russian output. And if that holds for just a few weeks, pressure will build up within the Russian system through their pipes all the way back to the wellheads, and they're going to have to shut it in. And as a rule in the permafrost, once you shut it in, that well is now never going to be turned on again because you get cracks throughout the system from the pressure builds. This is the permafrost. It's problematic in many ways. That crude doesn't come back. And the only way that the Russians were able to bring it back after the post-Cold War collapse was by bringing in Western technicians who are no longer available. So at some point later this year, we're looking at somewhere between 3 and 6 million barrels of Russian and Kazakh crude just falling off the market and never returning. That's not priced in yet because it hasn't happened yet, but we'll get there. I'll put a number on the price. If this had happened very, very quickly back in March, we'd probably be talking about $170 crude. That might be a little bit high now because the Chinese have partially gone offline with their lockdowns. We've had a little bit of demand destruction. We've got the shale sector accelerating their output. They're probably going to be able to kick another 1.5 million barrels into the system before the end of the year. That suggests that 170 is probably a little high, but 150 is still a good kind of stake in the ground. Probably. The energy price is very fuzzy.
According to Peter Zeihan, the world has not yet felt the strain of the lack of crops simply because we are still consuming last year's harvest. With the EU boycotting Russian oil, this could lead to a crippling energy crisis, as Russian oil is completely removed from the markets. What does this all mean? Well, we're talking about millions of barrels of oil, so this will clearly send shockwaves across the world. Gulf countries will be put under even greater pressure as the supply of oil is crunched worldwide. To sum it all up, Peter Zeihan talks about how China is in the middle of an insane chaos. He believes that China will be hit with multiple crises, these being the current economic crisis it is in, a labor crisis, an energy crisis, a food crisis, or possibly a famine brought about by a crop crisis, and a political crisis. While it is unclear how China's downfall will affect the world, Peter says that it is inevitable, and we will see more trouble in China over the next few months. What are your thoughts on China's downfall? How do you think this will affect China's role in the global economy? Give us your thoughts in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed this video, give us a like and subscribe, and we'll catch you on the next one.